power! I can't...
If you survive a plane crash, obviously everyone considers it a miracle. But for those who survived the crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 in 1972, it's just a miracle. The beginning of another horror story, a haunting story that torments people to this day. Terrible Friday, October 13th, 1972, fateful flight. Carrying talented young men, crashed in the majestic Andes. Mistakes in calculation caused the plane to crash into the mountainside, floating in a sky filled with fierce and turbulent winds. Starting from here, they had to face a harsh battle of survival lasting 72 days and nights at an altitude of 3,600 meters, where there was only white snow, no water source or vegetation. The survival instinct arose in desperate circumstances, forcing them to make horrifying decisions, eating their teammates to maintain life. Difficulties continuously came, testing their mind and body to the extreme. It was time for them to save themselves. Prepare yourself for a long, arduous, and challenging journey with Flight 571 of the Uruguayan Air Force. Can they overcome their limits and win this tough battle for survival? On October 12th, a Fairchild FH-227D turboprop aircraft of the Uruguay Air Force took off from Carrasco International Airport. The flight was carrying members of Montevideo's Old Christians Rugby Club to play against the Old Boys in Santiago. Bad weather forced them to spend a night in Mendoza, Argentina, at the foot of the mountains. On October 13, 1972, the plane carrying 19 members of the Old Christians rugby team, along with their relatives and fans, traveled from Uruguay's capital Montevideo to Santiago, Chile, to participate in a rugby match. In addition to the 40 people on the plane, there were also 5 crew members. The single-engine, twin-turbine aircraft has been in service for just 4 years. As clouds obscured the Andean peaks, the inexperienced pilot thought the plane was approaching the Chilean city of Curacao, but in reality it was 70 kilometers away. So, the pilot let the plane prepare to land. By the time he realized there was a mountain in front of him and not the imagined landing strip, it was too late. The plane began to sink into the snow when it encountered the mountains. The Fairchild crashed into anonymous peak, later named Cerro Cellar, located between Cerro Sosnido and the Tinguiririca volcano, near the border of Argentina and Chile. The plane crashed into a mountain peak at an altitude of 4,200 meters above sea level. This peak pulled the right wing out of the plane so hard that the stabilizer was thrown off, creating a large hole in the rear of the fuselage. The plane crashed into the second peak. The left wing was pulled off, leaving only the fuselage in the air. Of the 45 passengers, 12 died in an instant. 5 more died the next morning, and on the 8th day, another died of his injuries. The remaining 27 people encountered many difficulties in the cold weather on the mountain. Many people were injured when the plane crashed, such as having their legs broken when they were crushed by the plane seat. The survivors lacked equipment such as eyeglasses to prevent snow blindness, although one of the last survivors, Adolfo Fito Strauch, made several pairs of sunglasses to protect himself from the sun, winter jackets, and shoes, suitable for snowy mountain areas. The most disastrous thing was the lack of medical equipment, so the 2 surviving first-year medical students had to use the remaining parts of the plane to bind their bones. 3 countries sent people to find the plane. However, they could not see the white plane in the snow from the air, and they stopped searching after 8 days. Students among the surviving passengers found a portable radio on the plane, and on the 11th day, Roy heard that the search was called off. In Alive, the story of the Andes survivors, based on interviews with survivors, Piers Paul Red describes the situation when they heard the news. Everyone was gathering around Roy, and when they heard the news, they began to cry and pray, except Paradu. He looked up at the mountain to the west calmly. Gustavo Coco Nikolic stepped out of the plane, and when he saw their faces, knew what they had heard. Nikolic climbed into the hole through the pile of suitcases and football uniforms, bent down into the dark mouth of the tunnel, and looked at the gloomy faces looking up at him. "Guys," he cried, "there's good news. We just heard it on the radio. They've called off the search." There was only silence in the crowded plane. When the hopelessness of their situation overwhelms them, they cry. How can that be good news? Perez shouted at Nikolic. Because it means, Nikolic said, we're going to get ourselves out of this place. This child's courage prevented an overflow of despair. 88 to 89. First printing. Those still alive and not seriously injured or in a coma used parts from the plane such as seats, luggage, and other debris as shelter. Airplane seat cushions are used as snowshoes. One passenger used a sun visor from the pilot's cabin, wire and bra to make goggles to avoid snow blindness. He also found a way to melt snow to drink water. They tried to write the letters SOS with lipstick on the fuselage of the crashed plane, but didn't have enough lipstick to write the letters very large. The survivors lacked medical care or proper clothing and were stranded on the mountain as temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. What little food source they had was quickly depleted. Rescue teams from Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay had to use all their strength to search for plane debris in the vast mountain range, but could not find them. A glimmer of hope emerged when survivors found a transistor radio in the rubble and used it to listen for updates on the authorities' search efforts. On the 11th day, they heard an announcement on the radio that the search had been stopped. 8 bars of chocolate, 1 box of mussels, 3 jars of jam, some nuts and dried fruit, some candy, and a bottle of wine are all the living can eat. They tried to maintain that food for as long as possible, so much so that one man had to eat a peanut for 3 days. But that amount of food is only enough for 1 week. When they are so hungry, some people have to eat cotton and leather from airplane seats. Nando Paradu, then 22 years old, was one of the lucky survivors. He wrote in his memoir, Miracle in the Andes, published in 2006, "At high altitudes, the body's need for calories is even greater. We were truly starving, with no hope of finding food." Finally, as the frozen bodies of the dead lie around them, they are forced to consider their only chance of survival. Roberto Canessa, then a 19-year-old medical student, was a witness who survived the most catastrophic air disaster in 1972. He said in his 2016 memoir titled, "I Had to Survive." Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. We ran out of food from what we found on the plane, and there were no plants or animals around. We knew the answer, but it was terrible. The bodies of our friends and comrades, still preserved intact in the snow and ice, contained vital proteins that kept us alive. Is it possible to do that? From left to right, Gustavo Zerbino, Eduardo Strauch, Mr. Paradu, second right, and Javier Methol. 2 boys in the front row, Adolfo Fito Strauch and Carlos Perez, were also lucky to survive. We struggled mentally for a long time. I walked outside, stepped on the snow, and asked God for direction. Without his permission, I felt like I was infringing on my friends' memories, attacking my friends' memories. Steal their souls. Canessa recalls telling himself right after the plane crashed that if he died, the survivors would be allowed to eat him to survive. It will be a great honor for me that after my heart stops beating, my body will help those who are still alive to wait until the day they can get off the mountain. I want to fulfill that duty. Canessa is now a white-haired doctor, remembered. Canessa's skin turned pale and her toes began to turn black from hypothermia. I dreamed about Lori, my lover who is in Montevideo, Uruguay's capital. Will she find a new boyfriend? How can my mother overcome this pain? He recalled. A woman who refused to eat finally died on her 60th day at the top of the mountain, having become so thin that she weighed only about 25 kilograms. One night, an avalanche engulfed the fuselage of the plane while everyone was sleeping inside. 8 people died. The 16 survivors were trapped in the snow-filled fuselage of the plane, buried in snow up to their necks, and it took them 3 days to escape. The survivors discussed climbing over the mountains and seeking help, but their efforts failed due to the bitter cold, malnutrition, and altitude. They also don't know their exact location. 2 months after the accident, on December 12, 1972, Canessa and Nando decided to go west. They had no maps or climbing experience, but still braved everything to navigate the difficult terrain. Wearing clothes taken from the dead, and carrying socks containing frozen human flesh, they began their journey down the mountain without any climbing experience. On the 9th day, after they changed course and descended into a valley, 2 exhausted men lying flat on the ground attracted the attention of several men riding horses across the river. They tried to loudly announce that they did not dare to cross the river because it was too dangerous. The horsemen stopped to listen, signaled and shouted, "Tomorrow." Before sunrise the next morning, the other person returned, carrying pen and paper, tied it to a rock and threw it across the river. "Tell me what you need," the note said. "We had a plane crash in the mountains. We have been walking for 10 days now. There are 14 survivors on the plane. We have no food, our health is exhausted," Nando wrote, throwing it back. "I understand," the other person gestured. 3 Chilean military helicopters were dispatched, and on the 22nd, exactly 72 days after the plane crash, search teams finally reached the remaining 16 survivors. They were taken off the mountain with broken bones, frostbite, dehydration, malnutrition, and scabies. The lucky survivors were very worried, afraid that the public and relatives of the bodies they ate would condemn them and not forgive them. But there are also many people who defend, protect, and understand the difficulties of the survivors during the 72 days after the accident. After that, the victims' families also reduced their harshness and accepted to forgive them. Canessa continued to study medicine and became a doctor and organ transplant specialist. He recounted his miraculous survival story through the book, I Must Live. Plane Crash in the Andes Motivated Me to Save People, released by Constable Publishing House in early March 2016. Many years have passed, but Canessa still couldn't shake the obsession and torment of those days near death.